Michelle Alexander is a legal theorist, civil rights activist, and writer. Her book, The New Jim Crow, has been extremely influential because it was written for a general audience, and it's actively taught in many departments, or at least highly recommended on reading lists about race. As far as I know, there aren't any philosophers who talk about race and the drug war, both of which are pretty important in our society. So this text struck me as necessary reading material. I assigned the title chapter from this book, and I'm going to give you a lot of background on it and raise some of the criticisms that it received, since it does make some empirical claims as well. This is roughly the question that this book is attempting to address. How much does the war on drugs contribute to racial inequality in the United States? Alexander's answer is quite a lot compared to other things, especially compared to some ideas that are mainstream. For instance, the idea that black fathers abandon their children, or that criminals roughly deserve the time they receive in jail. Alexander is going to spend about an equal amount of time arguing that the drug war has generated substantial inequality, and argue that various other factors for this inequality are misunderstood or overblown. I want to start by including this snippet from Nixon's former chief of staff, who said, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." This is pretty infamous, and it shows that some stuff can go on behind the scenes that makes individuals appear like they're the problem, when the real problem is how the system is set up. And this problem isn't confined to one administration. So, back when the Democrats were really tough on crime, the Clinton administration really just picked up where Reagan left off, supporting legislation that banned drug felons from public housing, no matter how minor the offense, and denying them basic public benefits, including food stamps. This is roughly where the idea of systemic or structural racism gets traction. Structural racism is defined something like this. Individual parts of the system, so laws, hiring practices, access to various opportunities, housing, and education, are race neutral, but together they lead to racially disparate outcomes. Some conservatives, including Thomas Sowell, who we read earlier, say that the concept of structural or systemic racism has no meaning. But it seems pretty clear from the description here what structural racism amounts to. And when you have people in the government admitting that the system is devised or created against some people, there's really no other way to call it than structurally racist. If we're just taking that quote from Nixon's chief of staff, we can call it plainly racist. The idea that it's structural, or quote-unquote structural, might be too nice a label for that quote itself, because structural roughly suggests that it's no particular individual's fault. When talking about structural racism, we mean to say that there are a collection of laws or hiring practices or opportunities in health, housing, education, and other domains of well-being that are distributed unequally. People have unequal opportunity when it comes to these resources. Together, it makes a huge difference that leads to drastically disproportionate outcomes based on race. Now I'm going to reference a paper that Alexander wrote so we can get really clear about what she's saying. I linked it here if you want to look at it through CU's library, but you don't have to. Alexander's thesis in this book is that mass incarceration of poor people of color is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Notice that she says moral equivalent, so morality is the relevant point of comparison here. The social structure is roughly the same, blacks at the bottom, whites on top. It's just that the language to justify it is different. Instead of talking about Jim Crow, we're now talking about color blindness or colorblind policies. And colorblind policies are responsible for the disparities instead of overtly racist policies. Now, there are a lot of things that Alexander says throughout her book to make this point. For instance, she says, a system of convict leasing followed slavery, and black men were arrested, sent to prisons, and then leased to plantations. More African American adults are under correctional control than in 1850. In 2007, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870. In many large urban areas in the United States, the majority of working-age African-American men have criminal records. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population exploded from around 300,000 to 2 million. If we return to the incarceration rates of the 1970s, we would have to release 4 out of 5 prisoners. This is despite crime rates being at historical lows. Drug convictions alone accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system, and more than half of the increase in the state prison population system between 1985 and 2000. Drug convictions increased by 1,000% since the start of the war on drugs. Now, that's a lot of information, and this kind of shotgun argumentative style can be really persuasive, but it's not clear that this would fully justify Alexander's thesis. In order to justify her thesis, we need to examine some very particular evidence and how that evidence all hangs together, and we'll get to that in a second. Perhaps the most important point, one that's not unique to Alexander, is that people of all races use and sell drugs at similar rates. However, people who do time for drug crimes are overwhelmingly black and brown, and in some states, black people constitute 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. Now, that seems really problematic, and the problem is really straightforward. You can't have a system where people commit a crime equally, but members of one race are 4/5 of those convicted. So it's pretty reasonable to think based on that alone that something has gone seriously wrong. Alexander goes on to talk about some similarities between between Jim Crow and mass incarceration. The first is about voting. Prisoners are denied the right to vote in 48 states and D.C., and nationwide, nearly 1 in 7 black men are either temporarily or permanently disenfranchised. She also mentions exclusion from jury service and issues obtaining employment. There is employment discrimination, regardless of when the crime was committed. In her 2011 paper, she cites a survey where 70% of employers said they would not hire a drug felon convicted for sales or possession. There's also housing discrimination, where those labeled felons may be barred from public housing for 5 years or more and legally discriminated against for the rest of their lives, and they're barred from other public benefits as well. This leads to an unsurprising but really bad reoffense rate. About 70% of released prisoners are rearrested within 3 years, and the majority of those who return to prison do so within a matter of months because the barriers to mere survival on the outside are so immense. Alexander draws a distinction about the potential causes of these disparities. So, although there are similarities between Jim Crow and mass incarceration, this is an important point of difference. She roughly says that the war on drugs is more about indifference to the race of people who are arrested, convicted, and stamped as felons. So, for instance, on page 201, you find Alexander comparing drunk driving sentences to other drug offenses. She writes, "Although drunk driving carries a far greater risk of violent death than the use or sale of illegal drugs, the societal response to drunk drivers has generally emphasized keeping the person functional and in society while attempting to respond to the dangerous behavior through treatment and counseling. People charged with drug offenses, though, are disproportionately poor people of color. They are typically charged with felonies and sentenced to prison. Possession of a tiny amount of crack cocaine carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison." So here Alexander is saying that the problem is that people are, in fact, sincere about being tough on crime or tough on drugs. And that's what leads her to mention this quote from Martin Luther King: "Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." It is a problem, Alexander thinks, that people are sincerely unaware about these disparities in mass incarceration. But how exactly are people unaware? Well, she describes 2 ways that people are unaware. First, she says that if someone were to visit the United States from another country or another planet and ask, is the U.S. criminal justice system some kind of tool of racial control, most Americans would deny that, right? Numerous reasons would leap to mind as to why that can't be the case. And the visitor would be told that crime rates, black culture, or bad schools were to blame. And in this sense, a system can be colorblind but racially oppressive, and people fail to see how supposedly neutral policies can lead to racial disparities. Second, statistics may undermine actual employment rates, which are closer to 24% for less educated black men. She says that during the 1990s, which was the best time for the rest of America, the true jobless rates for non-college black men was a staggering 42%. In this way, also, affirmative action can be misleading because people just see black men and women as lawyers and CEOs and think everything is okay. So that is roughly Alexander's view. Now I'm going to talk about some objections. Someone might argue that there are other confounding cultural factors that lead to these racial disparities. So, if only black people would pick themselves up by the bootstraps and stop having avocado toast for breakfast or something, they might have a chance at avoiding prison. Now, of course, I'm being a little facetious about this objection. Let me discuss some more serious objections to Alexander's empirical evidence. And anyway, this is an objection that Alexander herself considers. So let's talk about some more substantive objections. One problem is that it's a major point of the new Jim Crow that drug offenses and not violent crime account for the rising prison population. However, John Pfaff in his book argues that although the statistics are shocking, they're not important to the problems that we face. So, in 2014, around 53% of prisoners were in jail for violent offenses, and around 16% were in jail for drug offenses. So, Pfaff is arguing that violent crimes drive mass incarceration, not drug offenses. And there was massive violent crime in the U.S. from the 70s to the 90s that could account for Alexander's claim on the previous slide about unemployment rates. Pfaff also criticizes Alexander for framing the issue as a federal one, but local and state policies are often more important and really tough to navigate. So he concludes that it won't be enough to get low-level drug offenders out of prison. Now, the Brookings Institution, a mostly bipartisan think tank, frames the mass incarceration problem in terms of stock and flow. That involves asking the 2 questions I have numbered here. The first question is, how many people experience incarceration as a result of drug-related crime over a certain time period? The second question is, what proportion of the prison population at a particular moment in time was imprisoned for a drug-related crime? Well, they conclude that prison prosecution is a big part of new incarcerations, and rolling them back would help some, but it wouldn't entirely solve the problem. So they describe a sort of middle position between Alexander and Pfaff. In light of all this evidence, what should we do? If you've been watching the videos, especially those with statistics in them, you know I'm not going to give you a good answer. But this is Alexander's answer. She suggests that there should be some kind of broad-based social movement against the war on drugs, one that acknowledges it hurts people of all colors. And that strikes me as a good way to end, because the moral or political problem here is at least one about drugs. Whether it's mostly about race is slightly a more controversial issue. But race is certainly implicated, and rolling back some of these policies would likely be a good thing, a measure that even conservatives like Sowell would agree with.